This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you on May 16th, 2024 from Athens, Greece with my rant of the week. My subject this week will be the tawdry, tedious, and tiresome subject of alleged foreign interference in the domestic politics of Western states. But before I launch into it, I just wanted to say a few words about which part of Athens I happen to be in today because it's highly pertinent to my rant. The section in which I'm currently strolling is called Exarcheia. And Exarcheia is famous or infamous, depending upon your point of view, for being the center, the heartbeat of anti-fascist and socialist and anarchist activism and resistance to oppression, imperialism, and fascism. And one of the reasons for which this particular quarter of central Athens has so much historical importance for Greece is that steps away from here lies the campus of the Polytechnic University in Athens. And in 1973, that was the site of an uprising against the US-backed military junta of George Papadopoulos, in which the Greek military massacred 40 civilians. Just so you understand who this brutal dictator was, George Papadopoulos was a colonel in the Greek army, and he was known by the Americans to have been a collaborator with the Nazis in World War II. And after he was installed as dictator with the help and orchestration of the CIA, he became known in US intelligence circles as the first CIA agent to be installed as a dictator of a foreign country. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds to me a little bit like foreign interference in the domestic affairs of Greece's politics. But it doesn't stop there. We could go on and on with examples of foreign interference in the affairs of Greek politics. For example, after the Second World War, when Stalin and the white supremacist Churchill did a dirty deal which assigned Yugoslavia to the Soviet sphere of influence and Greece to the British sphere of influence, and because the communists in Greece had put up the most effective resistance to the brutal Nazi occupation, they were in the best position to take power. So Churchill, once he secured control, or at least Stalin's agreement that Greece would lie within the British sphere of influence, he assembled a motley collection of monarchists, Nazi collaborators, and right-leaning Republicans to wage a civil war against the communists. And ultimately, the British-backed insurgents won, defeated the communists, but that left Greece after a already brutal Nazi occupation in smoking ruins. And in fact, it was out of that disaster that my parents, against really their will, decided to emigrate to Canada. Being from a poor agricultural community in the south of Greece and not having any high school education, there were no opportunities here for them. And that's how I ended up being born in Canada rather than in the land to which I am indigenous, which is Greece. In any case, that too, one would say, constitutes an egregious case of foreign interference in the affairs of a Western state. And then, more recently, beginning in 2010, when Europe began to descend into a financial crisis, the European Union, led principally by Germany, decided to inflict upon the Greek people a vicious neoliberal austerity program, the likes of which had never been seen in any Western country. And in 2015, the Greeks who were rebelling against the impacts, the poverty rate soared, the suicide rate soared, the health system was falling into a state of decay, real wages were falling. They decided to elect a party that had not previously held power in Greece called Syriza, which presented itself as a radically left-wing party, but in fact its program, the one that it ran on in the 2015 election, was pretty much social democratic. Certainly there was nothing communist in it. It couldn't fairly be described, in my view, as radical. Nonetheless, they voted for that party. And the moment that that party won, which shocked the European neoliberal elites, they did everything they could to destroy the party and began to demand that Syriza impose upon Greeks, despite the promises it had made in the election campaign of 2015, a neoliberal program that was even harsher than the ones that they had inflicted upon Greece beginning in 2010. So the prime minister of the day, the leader of Syriza, Alexis Tsipras, decided, with threats of expulsion from the Eurozone and devastation of the Greek economy hanging over him. Those threats were coming from Germany, they were coming from Brussels, they were coming from the ECB, the IMF. He decided to put the demands of the creditors of Greece, called the Troika, to a referendum. And despite all of the threats, the Greek people, to their great credit, voted overwhelmingly to reject the neoliberal austerity program being demanded by the Troika of creditors. So what did the Troika of creditors do? They decided to use coercion, blackmail, to effectively force Tsipras to impose a set of neoliberal conditions that were even worse than the ones that Greek voters had rejected in the referendum. Now that sounds to me, I don't know, like a case of foreign interference in the domestic politics of Greece. Then we come to the current day. We've been listening ad nauseum for years now of claims of Russian and Chinese interference in the domestic affairs of Canada and other Western states. I mean, this has been ubiquitous and relentless throughout the Western political discourse. The Chinese and the Russians are undermining, those damn Ruskies, those dirty commies in China. They're undermining the sanctity of our democracy, our robust electoral processes. This must be stopped. So what does the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau do in Canada? He decides, under great pressure, to appoint a Quebec judge to conduct a commission of inquiry into foreign interference. And on May 3rd, the judge presiding over that inquiry issued a report on the question of foreign interference in the last two federal elections in Canada in 2021 and 2019. And after conducting hearings for 21 days, and hearing from over 60 witnesses, she said that there had been some foreign interference. Personally, I question the evidentiary basis of that assertion, but here's the key finding that she made. It did not impact the outcome of either federal election, and Canada's electoral processes remain robust. That's the word that she used. But the key finding is there was no impact, whatever the foreign interference may have been. Now, let's contrast that to the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Greece by the CIA in 1967 and the installation of a Nazi collaborator to brutalize and suppress the Greek people for some 7 years. Or the European Commissions and ECBs and IMFs and whatever other acronym is out there, their insistence that despite the results of the Greek election of January 2015, despite the referendum held in the summer of that year, which rejected their austerity program, the democratically elected government of Greece had to impose upon Greeks a set of austerity conditions that were even worse than those that had been rejected in the referendum. Which of those sounds like foreign interference to you? I think the answer is pretty clear. Which brings me to the question of what is the reality in Canada today? You know, I want to start by asking this very simple question. You don't need to conduct a commission of inquiry with over 60 witnesses over 21 days to know the answer to this question. Where do Canadians get most of their news? Well, a very large chunk of it comes from the American propaganda networks with which we are constantly bombarded in Canada. NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and on and on and on. These are the principal sources of information about world affairs and even domestic affairs for a great many Canadians. And even the Canadian networks, CBC, Global News, and CTV are chock full of American commentators. So for example, you will find frequently the bloodthirsty, psychopathic lunatic John Bolton being interviewed on Canadian television networks as a reliable, respectable, and sane source of information about geopolitics. David Frum, who is Canadian but who was the speechwriter of George Bush when he launched his criminal war of aggression against Iraq, and who used his speechwriting skills to help the Bush administration deceive the American public about the basis of that war. He too is a frequent guest on Canadian television networks, news programs, in which he pontificates about how to start the latest war and then lose it. And on top of all of that, there's not just the news content which is emanating out of the United States from openly, brazenly propagandistic individuals and news networks, but there's also the think tankocracy, as I like to call it in Canada. I'm going to give you an example. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a neoconservative, neoliberal think tank in Canada, which holds itself out as being one of the most influential think tanks in the country. You know, it used to disclose, for some number of years, its principal funders. They included the US State Department and other agencies of the US government. Then, and I think it was 2021, for some reason they stopped disclosing it. I think it had to do with a report that was issued by the Canada Files, which shed some unflattering light on their sources of funding, and the information was drawn from their annual reports. They decided to stop disclosing their principal funders in their annual reports. And they put a statement in their annual report, again, I think it was 2021, in which they said, we'll disclose our principal funders to anybody who appears at our offices in Ottawa and requests disclosure of the list. And so I went to their offices last year. I requested disclosure of the list. They didn't have it, but a young intern who was there were no senior people present at the time, promised me that it would be delivered to me in a few days, and it would have to be prepared by, an appropriate financial official of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And then a few days later, I get a letter from a lawyer for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in which he says, we've changed our policy. Even though you showed up personally and our annual report says that we would show you our list of funders if you came and asked for it in person, we are not going to share the list of funders with anybody anymore. What are they hiding? My guess is that they're receiving a very considerable amount of money from the US government or agencies of the US government and from US corporations that are in bed with the US government. And I doubt very much that this problem is limited to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It almost certainly applies to the other neoconservative, neoliberal think tanks in Canada. For example, the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute. All these people who are routinely quoted by the corporate media in Canada, presented to us as being independent, but they're not independent of the oligarchy. They're not independent in any meaningful sense of the neoconservative cabal in Washington. Ultimately, they are controlled by them because they are funded by them and they are staffed by people who come from that world and who think like them. So at the end of the day, who's actually interfering in the politics, the domestic affairs of Canada? Is it really China and Russia? I mean, how many people in Canada get their news from Sputnik? How many people get their news from RT? I mean, you can barely access these things in Canada anymore. Or what about the Chinese state broadcaster? How many people are actually getting their news, their information from the Chinese state broadcaster? I mean, let's be real here. What planet do you live on? And quite apart from the fact that you've got these think tanks and you've got these, former senior officials from the US government appearing on Canadian television, quite apart from the fact that you've got Canadians consuming huge amounts of fake information from propagandistic American networks that are in bed with the US government. You have another form of propaganda. They call it advertising, but in fact it's just corporate propaganda. And the corporate propaganda is everywhere. It's on social media, it's on billboards when you're driving down the street, it is in the public transportation system, it's at sporting events all over the stadia that we go to watch these events at. It's being broadcast up on the big screen when you go to see the cinema. I mean, you can hardly escape corporate propaganda in Canada. It's everywhere. It's 24/7, nonstop. And where is it coming from? It's coming overwhelmingly from US corporations or their Canadian subsidiaries. And these corporations, many of them, for example, Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, Google, Facebook, and so forth, are deeply enmeshed within the national security apparatus of the United States. And then on top of all of that, you have yet another form of propaganda to which we are being subjected, emanating from the United States, and that's the entertainment industry. I mean, 95% of what Hollywood puts out nowadays, which is consumed in enormous quantities by Canadians, isn't cinematic art. It's just straight up propaganda. I mean, does anybody actually think that Maverick Top Gun is cinematic art? Or the Oscar-winning movie The Right Stuff about the US space program? Or how about Black Hawk Down, which won the Best Picture at the Oscars and presents an insanely biased and unremittingly positive view of the US military misadventure in Somalia that resulted in so much death and suffering, including the loss of many American soldiers. That movie, which is nothing but a non-stop propaganda exercise for the US military, won the Best Picture. I mean, we go to these cinemas and we pay money to be propagandized by the producer of the film and the artists, the so-called artists who actually are involved in the production of the cinematic work. And then on top of that, we have to sit there for like 10 or 15 minutes before the propaganda piece begins and watch corporate propaganda. And we're paying for the so-called privilege of having to be subjected to all of this. This is what Canadians deal with. You know, an interesting fact is that two-thirds of Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the US border. That's 4% of Canada's territory. We're constantly interacting with Americans. We're constantly exposed to the propaganda to which they are exposed. There is no country on God's green earth whose propaganda system has a greater impact on domestic politics in Canada than the United States. And let me tell you something, my friends, that is the one subject that nobody wants to talk about at this Commission of Inquiry. Nobody. I don't fault the judge. At the end of the day, it's up to the witnesses, it's up to the interveners, the people who have been granted standing to present a fair and accurate picture of what is truly influencing and affecting and perverting democratic discourse in Canada, and none of them wants to talk about the elephant in the room. And that's why I have accepted a request on the part of an organization. I'm not going to mention that organization now, I will in due course, that has been granted standing in this Commission of Inquiry. It's not finished. The report issued on May 3rd was only the first step. There will be another report issued, at least one, and I've accepted the request to represent this organization at the hearings to come. I'm going to do that on a pro bono basis, and I hope to have an opportunity on behalf of that organization to talk about the elephant in the room, to actually look at it, point at it, and say, this is what we should be most concerned about, just as the Greek people have experienced. They've experienced firsthand, in the most brutal way, in the most shameless way, foreign interference in the domestic affairs of their country. And it did not come from China or Russia or any other non-Western state. It came from their supposed ally, the United States, and also came from their supposed allies in Europe. And before I close it out, I just want to point out to you this ugly thing you see behind me here, this steel wall. Well, on the other side of that wall used to be something called Exarcheia Square. It was kind of the nerve center of this part of the city, Exarcheia, and anarchists, anti-fascists, socialists hung out there. It was a place of discussion. It was a place of camaraderie. Many people who had escaped to Greece as desperate refugees or migrants, they weren't here legally, but they simply were looking for a better way of life. They would congregate in this square. They felt relatively safe here because they knew that the anarchists and the anti-fascists would protect them. So a couple of years ago, the Greek government says, hey, you know what? We're going to build a subway station in Exarcheia Square. And they erected this metal barrier which cut off the public from the square. I mean, look at this ugly behemoth. And ever since then, no one has been able to enter, other than the workers, into what used to be the nerve center of this bastion of resistance. I was here last year, and this metal barrier was actually not extended out this far. You can see behind me how narrow this passageway is. It actually was another, I would say, 10 meters away from where it is currently on my left. But I guess they weren't satisfied that they had cut off enough of the space from the public, and so they expanded it outwards. And mysteriously, it never seems that they make any progress on the construction of this subway station. It is almost as though, and in fact, let's be blunt about this, it is a pretext for preventing people whose political views the government, the US-backed government, the vassal of the United States, whose political views they do not like. It is a frontal assault on the Greek people's right of freedom of association, and guess what? The primary architects of this eyesore are Greece's allies. This is Dimitri Lascaris, coming to you from Exarcheia in Athens, Greece on May 16th, 2024.